It all started in the summer of 1982, when Lisa Graves moved into a small, unassuming house on a quiet street in San Pedro, California. The house, built in the 1940s, had seen many families come and go. It wasn't anything remarkable, a modest, single-story home with peeling white paint, overgrown hedges, and a worn-out wooden fence. But to Lisa, fresh out of a toxic relationship and looking for a fresh start, it seemed like a sanctuary. Or so she thought. The first few nights were peaceful. Lisa unpacked her belongings, rearranged furniture, and began to settle into her new life. But soon the house began to reveal its true nature. It started with small things. Misplaced items, flickering lights, and strange noises that echoed through the empty rooms. At first, Lisa brushed them off as the quirks of an old house. That is, until the night she woke up to find her bedroom door slowly creaking open on its own. Lisa sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the darkness of the hallway beyond. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the wind, or maybe she hadn't closed it properly. But deep down, a cold dread began to settle in her gut. The next day, Lisa mentioned the strange occurrence to her neighbor, Mrs. Hawkins, an elderly woman who had lived on the street for decades. Mrs. Hawkins listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with each word. "That house," Mrs. Hawkins said in a hushed tone, "has a history. It's seen things, dark things. The last person who lived there didn't leave under normal circumstances." Lisa pressed her for details, but Mrs. Hawkins only shook her head, muttering something about some things being better left buried. It was clear the old woman knew more than she was willing to share. That night, the atmosphere in the house felt different, heavier, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Lisa tried to distract herself with TV, but the static-filled screen seemed to mock her, flickering with distorted images that made her uneasy. She finally decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would bring her some relief. But sleep would not come easily. As soon as she turned off the lights, the room plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. Lisa lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to calm her racing thoughts. That's when she heard it. A soft whispering, like a voice carried on the wind. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the leaves outside. But then it grew louder, more insistent. The voice was unintelligible, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It wasn't just the sound itself, but the way it seemed to come from all around her. From the walls, the floor, the very air she breathed. Lisa's skin prickled with fear as she pulled the covers up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room. And then, without warning, the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. Lisa's breath hitched in her throat as she strained to listen, her heart thudding in her ears. A loud bang echoed through the house, making Lisa jump out of bed. It sounded like it had come from the living room. Gathering her courage, she grabbed a flashlight from her bedside table and crept down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards making her flinch. As she approached the living room, the air grew colder, sending shivers down her spine. When she reached the room, Lisa hesitated before pushing open the door. The flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing overturned furniture and scattered belongings. But what truly made her blood run cold was the sight of a message scrawled in red across the wall. "Leave now." The words dripped down the wall, the color too dark, too vivid to be just paint. Lisa's hand trembled as she stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight shaking with her. She reached out a tentative finger, and as soon as she touched the wall, a chilling realization hit her. It wasn't paint. It was blood. Lisa spun around, the flashlight catching a fleeting glimpse of something, someone, in the corner of the room. But when she turned the light on it, there was nothing there. Just an empty space where she could have sworn she saw a figure. Her mind raced with fear and confusion. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was she losing her mind? Or was there something else at play, something far more sinister? Lisa didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. She stayed up, huddled in a corner of her bedroom, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Every creak, every rustle outside sent her heart racing. And as the hours dragged on, she realized something terrifying. Whatever was in that house didn't want her there, and it was willing to do anything to drive her out. By morning, Lisa was a wreck. She called a friend, desperately seeking some kind of explanation, some reassurance that she wasn't going crazy. But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening, something that didn't belong in this world. And then came the smell. A rancid, putrid odor filled the house, so strong it made Lisa gag. It was the smell of decay, of something long dead. She followed the stench to the attic, where she found an old, dusty trunk hidden in a dark corner. The lock was rusted, the wood splintered and worn. With trembling hands, Lisa pried it open, revealing its contents. Old clothes, yellowed letters, and something else. Something wrapped in a decaying cloth. As she unwrapped the bundle, the smell intensified, making her eyes water. And then she saw it, a small, withered hand, no larger than a child's, curled into a fist. Lisa stumbled back, dropping the bundle as terror clawed at her throat. What had she just uncovered? And why was it hidden in her attic? But before she could even process the horror in front of her, the whispering started again, louder this time, and more distinct. It wasn't just random murmurs, it was a name repeated over and over, echoing through the house like a chant. Ava, Ava, Ava. Lisa didn't know who Ava was, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a haunting. It was something much worse. Something tied to the house, to the past, and now, to her. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Lisa stood frozen in place, every nerve on edge. And then slowly, ever so slowly, the trunk lid creaked shut on its own, as if something or someone was sealing it back up. Lisa knew she had to leave. But where could she go? And more importantly, would it even let her leave? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Lisa realized the terrible truth. This was just the beginning. When dawn finally broke, the golden light of morning did little to ease Lisa's fear. She felt as though she had been up all night, every nerve in her body frayed from the relentless terror. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind. The blood on the walls, the decaying hand in the attic, the chilling chant of the name *Ava*. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But she knew she had to do something. She couldn't live like this. Desperation drove her to search for answers, hoping to understand what was happening in her home. As soon as she felt it was safe to leave, Lisa headed to the local library, determined to uncover the history of the house. The library was quiet, the musty smell of old books filling the air. Lisa approached the librarian, an elderly man with a kind face and an air of wisdom. She explained, as calmly as she could, that she was researching the history of her home. The librarian listened patiently, his expression growing more serious as Lisa spoke. When she mentioned the address, his eyes narrowed slightly and he leaned in closer. "Do you know anything about the previous owners?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. The librarian nodded slowly. "That house, it's seen its share of tragedy. There was a young woman many years ago, Ava Martinez. She lived there with her husband, but their marriage was far from happy. There were rumors of abuse, of dark secrets behind closed doors. Ava was a kind soul, but she suffered greatly. Then one day, she disappeared." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Disappeared? What happened to her? The librarian sighed, his gaze drifting to the window as if he were lost in thought. No one knows for sure. Her husband claimed she ran away, but the police suspected foul play. There were no charges, though, not enough evidence. The case went cold and the husband moved away, leaving the house empty for years. The name echoed in Lisa's mind. Ava. It was the same name she had heard whispered in the darkness, the name that seemed to be at the center of all this. But why? Why was Ava haunting the house now after all these years? Armed with this new information, Lisa returned home, her mind racing. As she entered the house, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around her once more. The walls seemed to whisper, as if they knew she had uncovered part of their secret. That night, Lisa decided she needed to know more. She couldn't rest until she understood what had happened to Ava and why the spirit was still there. She began searching the house for anything that could provide answers. She scoured every room, every drawer, looking for something, anything, that might tell her more about Ava's tragic fate. Hours passed with no success. Exhaustion was setting in, but Lisa refused to give up. Just as she was about to abandon her search, she noticed something odd about the floorboards in the living room. One of them was loose, as if it had been tampered with. Heart pounding, Lisa pried the board up, revealing a small, dusty box hidden beneath the floor. With trembling hands, she opened it, finding a stack of old letters tied together with a frayed ribbon. The letters were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. As Lisa read through them, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The letters were written by Ava, detailing the abuse she suffered at the hands of her husband. He was cruel, controlling, and violent. The letters spoke of her fear, her desperation, and her plans to escape. But the last letter was different. It was unfinished, the handwriting shaky and uneven. It ended abruptly, with a single haunting sentence. "He won't let me leave." Lisa jumped, dropping the letters as the sound echoed through the house. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath visible in the icy air. She wasn't alone. A cold breeze swept through the room, rustling the papers on the floor. Lisa's eyes darted around, searching for the source of the draft, but the windows were closed. The air grew thicker, almost suffocating, and the smell of decay returned, stronger than before. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, just barely visible in the dim light, a figure stood. It was a woman, her features obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the anger radiating from her presence. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face twisted in pain and fury. It was Ava, there was no doubt about it. But this was not the gentle woman described in the letters. This was a tormented soul filled with rage. Lisa backed away, her mind racing. She wanted to run, to escape the house, but something held her in place. Ava's eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, Lisa felt a wave of emotion that wasn't her own. Fear, betrayal, and a deep, unrelenting sorrow. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and Ava's form became distorted, shifting and warping as if the very air around her was being torn apart. The walls began to shake, the floorboards creaking underfoot as if the house itself was alive. Objects flew off shelves, crashing to the ground in a cacophony of noise. Lisa stumbled back, nearly tripping over the loose floorboard. She had to get out now. But as she turned to flee, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the lock clicking into place on its own. Panic surged through her as she yanked at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The whispering started again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and intertwining, growing louder and more frantic. Lisa pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head, filling her mind with their pleas, their anger, their pain. "Help me, save me, don't leave me." The words echoed through her, each one like a knife twisting in her gut. And then amidst the chaos, she heard a new voice, deeper, more menacing, and filled with malice. "You're mine now." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on her as the figure of Ava advanced, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, desperate to find a way out. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. In a final, desperate act, Lisa grabbed one of the letters from the floor and held it out, as if it could somehow ward off the vengeful spirit. Ava stopped, her gaze shifting to the letter. For a moment, the anger in her eyes seemed to waver, replaced by something softer, something human. But it was only for a moment. The lights flickered again, and Ava's face twisted into a snarl, her form flickering like a broken film reel. The temperature in the room dropped even further, frost creeping across the windows as the voices reached a fever pitch. The last thing Lisa saw before the darkness consumed her was Ava's face, twisted in a mix of sorrow and rage, and the words scrawled in blood on the wall. "You can't leave." The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Lisa stood frozen in place, every nerve on edge. And then slowly, ever so slowly, the trunk lid creaked shut on its own, as if something, or someone, was sealing it back up. Lisa knew she had to leave. But where could she go? And more importantly, would it even let her leave? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Lisa realized the terrible truth. This was just the beginning. When Lisa awoke, she was no longer in the attic. The cold, damp air clung to her skin, and the darkness was so thick it felt like a living entity pressing down on her. The smell of decay still lingered, stronger than ever, and the weight of the doll in her hand was a grim reminder of the horrors she had just witnessed. But something was different. The silence that filled the space was unnerving, an absence of sound so complete that it made her ears ring. Lisa struggled to her feet, her body aching from the ordeal. She tried to orient herself, but the darkness was impenetrable, and the sense of being watched had intensified, as if countless eyes were on her from all directions. The whispering returned, but this time it was different. It was more insistent, more desperate. Lisa could barely make out the words, but the tone was clear. It was pleading, begging for something she couldn't understand. She clutched the doll tighter, its glass eyes seeming to glint even in the pitch black. The whispers swirled around her, filling her mind with a sense of dread so profound it nearly paralyzed her. But she knew she couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. Slowly she began to move, her hands outstretched, feeling her way through the darkness. Every step was tentative, every sound making her flinch. As she moved, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they coalesced into a single voice, a voice she recognized as Ava's. But this wasn't the vengeful spirit she had encountered before. This was a voice filled with fear, a voice that echoed with the pain of a life cut tragically short. "Please, help me, find him!" The words sent a chill down Lisa's spine. Asterisk, find him. Asterisk, who was Ava talking about? The child in the coffin? Or someone else? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers. Only the relentless darkness and the oppressive feeling of being trapped. And then suddenly, the void around her shifted, the darkness pulling back slightly as if something had changed. Lisa felt herself being dragged upward, the pressure easing as she was pulled back into consciousness. When Lisa opened her eyes, she was back in the house, lying on the cold, hard floor of the living room. The oppressive atmosphere had returned, the air thick with the same malevolent energy as before. But there was something different now, a clarity that hadn't been there before. Lisa struggled to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion. She looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. The house was eerily silent, the shadows lurking in every corner, but she could still feel the entity's presence, watching her, waiting for her next move. She knew now that the ritual hadn't worked because it wasn't the right one. The entity wasn't just a malevolent spirit, it was something much older, much darker. It wasn't just tied to the house. It was the house, a malevolent force that had consumed countless lives over the years, feeding off their fear and suffering. Ava's voice echoed in her mind again, urging her to face the truth. And then it hit her. The key to defeating the entity wasn't in the rituals or the sacrifices. It was in the house itself, in the secrets it had buried, in the souls it had consumed. Lisa knew what she had to do. She had to confront the entity, to force it to reveal its true nature, to expose the darkness that had been hidden for so long. It was the only way to end the nightmare once and for all. With renewed determination, Lisa began to move through the house, her steps slow and deliberate. She could feel the entity's presence growing stronger as she approached the attic, the air growing colder with each step. The stairs creaked underfoot, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing as if they were alive. When she reached the attic door, Lisa hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The attic was just as she remembered, dark, cold, and filled with an oppressive sense of dread. The small coffin still lay in the corner, the doll resting beside it, its eyes glinting in the dim light. But this time Lisa wasn't afraid. She stepped into the attic, her gaze fixed on the shadows that seemed to pulse and shift around her. The entity was here waiting for her, and she could feel its hatred, its desire to consume her. "Show yourself," Lisa demanded, her voice steady despite the fear that still lingered at the edges of her mind. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. I know what you are." For a moment, nothing happened. The attic remained silent, the shadows still. But then, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the darkness began to coalesce in the center of the room, forming a shape, a figure that was both human and inhuman, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The entity's true form was monstrous, a twisted mass of shadow and flesh, with a face that was both familiar and horrifying. It was Ava's husband, but distorted, his features twisted into a grotesque mockery of the man he had once been. His eyes burned with a hatred that was centuries old, a deep-seated evil that had festered and grown in the darkness of the house. "You think you can stop me?" the entity hissed, its voice a low, menacing growl. "You're nothing, just another soul to consume. You belong to me now." But Lisa didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze locked on the entity, refusing to back down. "I'm not yours," she said firmly. "And neither is Ava. You've taken enough lives. It ends now." The entity roared, the sound shaking the very foundations of the house. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Lisa, pulling her toward the entity with a force she couldn't resist. But even as she was dragged closer, Lisa kept her focus, refusing to give in to the fear. "I know what you are," Lisa repeated, her voice filled with conviction. "You're not just a spirit. You're the darkness that feeds on fear, on pain, on suffering. But you're nothing without those things. You're powerless without them." The entity's grip tightened, the shadows constricting around her like a vice. But Lisa didn't stop. She knew that the only way to defeat it was to take away its power, to strip it of the fear it fed on. "I'm not afraid of you," Lisa said, her voice growing stronger. "You have no power over me. I see you for what you really are, a parasite feeding on the lives you've destroyed. But it ends here." The entity shrieked, the sound a mixture of rage and fear. The shadows around Lisa began to waver, their hold on her weakening. She could feel the entity's power slipping, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. Lisa took a step forward, pushing through the darkness, her gaze never leaving the entity's twisted form. "You've taken enough from this world," she said. "It's time for you to go." The entity roared again, but this time the sound was weaker, less menacing. The shadows around it began to dissolve, the darkness retreating as if it were being pulled back into the void from which it had come. Lisa could feel the house shaking, the walls cracking and crumbling as the entity's power was stripped away. And then, with one final ear-piercing scream, the entity shattered, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The shadows evaporated, the cold air warming as the darkness was banished from the house once and for all. Lisa stood in the center of the attic, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exhaustion. The house was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere gone, replaced by a strange stillness. The battle was over and she had won. As she looked around the attic, she saw Ava's spirit standing in the corner. her form no longer twisted by rage or despair. She was smiling, her eyes filled with gratitude and peace. "Thank you," Ava whispered, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "You freed me. You freed us all." Tears filled Lisa's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. She watched as Ava's spirit began to fade, her form dissolving into the light that now filled the room. The doll on the floor glowed softly, its eyes no longer menacing but gentle, as if it too had been freed from the darkness. And then Ava was gone, her spirit finally at peace. The attic was empty now, the house no longer haunted by the malevolent entity that had consumed so many lives. Lisa was alone, but she felt a sense of calm, of closure. The nightmare was over. Lisa made her way down the stairs, her steps slow and measured. The house was bathed in sunlight now, the darkness that had once plagued it completely gone. She opened the front door and stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin for the first time in what felt like an eternity. As she walked away from the house, she felt a sense of relief, of freedom. The entity was gone, and with it, the fear and pain that had haunted the house for so long. But as she reached the edge of the property, she paused, turning back to look at the house one last time. It stood there, silent and still, no longer the ominous presence it had once been. But as Lisa gazed at it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, still lurking in the shadows. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. The house was at peace now, and so was she. With a final glance, she turned and walked away, leaving the San Pedro house and its dark history behind her. But as she walked, she couldn't help but feel a cold breeze brush against the back of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder. There was nothing there. The house was still, silent, and bathed in sunlight. But as Lisa continued down the street, the wind picked up, and for just a moment she thought she heard something. A whisper, faint and distant, carried on the breeze. "You can't leave.